Some students are worried that, if I take, 2 or even 3 gap years, I'll be so old when I start medical school. I think one of the biggest myths I have ever heard when it comes to applying to medical school, being pre-med, etc., is the fact that a gap year and taking a gap year in and of itself can hurt your chances at getting into medical school. Admittedly, when I was an undergrad, I haven't heard that much about people taking gap years before medical school, and also have never looked into it, so I can kind of understand where this myth came from. I also think when I first told my parents, like in senior year in undergrad, that I was going to take a gap year before applying to medical school, my parents were a little bit concerned. They were not fully in support of this decision, probably also because they haven't really heard of people doing that. So today I'm going to be breaking all of that down, and I'm going to be talking about why I personally took a gap year, what you can do during a gap year, and whether or not you should consider taking a gap year. And I hope by the end of the video you will find that gap years are actually nothing to be scared of and can actually be quite beneficial to your application if you decide to do one. The first reason why I decided to take a gap year was because I wanted more research that are clinically relevant. So all throughout undergrad, I did research with a professor in the business school. And because I was applying to MD-PhD, I wanted research that was a little bit more clinically relevant, which is why I ended up taking gap years to do that. Now, if you're applying to MD rather than MD-PhD programs, I would say that, clinically relevant research is still good to have, but I don't think is as dire of a situation if you happen to do something that's like a little bit less related to medicine or not related at all. I think in my situation, it was just very important to me to do some clinically relevant research because for MD-PhD programs, I feel like that would be more appropriate. And the second reason that I decided to take a gap year was I just wanted more time to finish my prereqs. If you wanted to attend medical school without taking any gap years between undergrad and medical school, then the time that you would need to apply is the summer before your senior year of undergrad. That means you need to have everything squared away by then, like letters of recommendation, all of your prereqs, as well as the MCAT, which is like kind of a big one. So what I see a lot of students do is they take the MCAT the winter break of their junior year or just sometime during their junior year. So by the time summer rolls around, they're ready to apply to medical schools. For me personally, I did not decide to do that. In fact, I didn't even finish all of my prereqs until my senior year of college. So again, typically people finish all of their prereqs before taking the MCAT. Can you take the MCAT before finishing all the prereqs? Yes, you can. No one's stopping you, but it's generally recommended that you have finished all of the pre-med prereqs before you take the MCAT. And I just wasn't there yet by the time I was in my junior year, so I just decided to take my time. I ended up finishing my prereqs in my senior year, took the MCAT right after I graduated from undergrad, and did 2 gap years because of that. By the way, a lot of this information is actually already covered in the My Journey video where I talk about how I became an MD-PhD student, all of my activities, stats, and everything that got me here today. So if you're interested, that video is going to be linked in my description. So because one of my reasons for wanting to do gap years was because I wanted more clinically relevant research, I ended up doing 2 full years of clinical research at the Department of Neurology at Yale University. For students in gap years, there are a couple different possible roles when it comes to clinical research. One is something like a clinical research coordinator, where you go around consenting patients, talking to them about kind of the trial they're participating in, etc. So that's one type of role. My role was a little bit different. My background was in statistics, and the mentor I was working with was looking for someone who was able to kind of do machine learning on the data that we have, and that's exactly what I did in that role. I ended up having several publications from my gap years as well as poster presentations, but kind of the best thing to result from my gap year experience is the fact that I met an amazing mentor who I still keep in touch with to this day. She's an MD-PhD. She has inspired me so much on this path and shaped me so much, honestly, as a student, as a aspiring physician scientist, and honestly, she is one of the reasons I recommend people do gap years, because like this kind of mentorship at that stage in your career is just so invaluable. And I honestly would not have met her if I didn't take a gap year, if I didn't take on this position. So now let's talk a little bit about what you can do if you're thinking of taking a gap year. If you're applying into a MD-PhD program or a PhD program, then I would highly recommend you do research of some kind. full-time research. MD-PhD programs in particular care about your research hours and your research experiences a lot, more so, I think, than clinical hours. If you think you're lacking in clinical hours and you're applying MD-PhD, let's say you think you need a little bit more shadowing or volunteering, I would do research full-time and then just volunteer or shadow in your other time. The reason I recommend that you do volunteering or acquire clinical hours more on a part-time or sporadic basis and doing research full-time is because I think MD-PhD programs in particular really prioritizes research hour and productivity. And so that's kind of what you should be aiming for in terms of what you want to do in your gap year. So that is my advice if you're interested in applying to MD-PhD or PhD programs. Now, if you're applying into an MD program or DO program, medical school in general, I would take a look at what you have going on in your application so far and identify your weaknesses and then target what you do for your gap years towards that weakness. If you're lacking in clinical hours, for example, you might look into things like becoming an EMT, a medical assistant, or scribing. Of course, these jobs have different requirements, and I think for things like EMT and becoming a medical assistant, you might need extra certifications that you have to figure out how to get. But these are kind of just like in general what pre-meds tend to do during their gap years. Clinical research is another really popular one, and I've also heard students working with nonprofits or even starting their own nonprofits and doing different global health projects. If you're looking at your application and you're thinking, maybe I need a little more research, then you could go for research opportunities. And finally, if you're looking at your application and you're like, I think I need a little bit of help with the GPA, there are definitely post-bac programs around. Some students decide to take extra classes on top of clinical volunteering or something like that to try to get a couple more credits to boost their GPA up a little bit. Basically with gap years, I find that the range of things you can possibly do, it's kind of just like the sky's the limit. In my opinion, you can do so many different things with it, and it just feels like you really can't go wrong as long as you kind of fill that time with something meaningful, whatever that looks like to you. And finally, should you take a gap year? I feel like I've alluded to this by now, hopefully, but if you feel like your application is lacking in some areas, whether that be GPA, volunteering, clinical hours, research, or maybe you haven't finished the prereqs like me, then a gap year is a good option. In my opinion, it's better to have an application that you feel confident about rather than one that feels a little bit more rushed or maybe has parts of it that you feel more insecure about just because you want to avoid taking a gap year. Some students are worried that, if I take, 2 or even 3 gap years, I'll be so old when I start medical school, everyone will be fresh out of undergrad, and that's not true at all. So these days, the majority of pre-meds actually take gap years, so I feel like the average starting age for medical school is now at, 24, even 25. And also coming into medical school, I had friends who took several gap years, so they were starting at age 26, and I think I even know someone who started at age 30. So at the end of the day, it is all personal, whether or not you take a gap year, whether or not you start medical school at age 22 or at age 26. But I do think that if your worry is that nobody's going to be my age if I start at 25, or if your worry is I'm not going to get any friends if I start medical school later, that is usually not a problem at most schools, and certainly not at mine. Another thing that I've heard from people who don't really like the idea of a gap year is that they might feel behind when they start medical school, just in terms of their age. But I do want to give a different kind of perspective. When you take gap years, those are not lost years. You could be working on projects, you could be publishing. There's so many things that people do during their gap years that I just don't consider them to be lost years or wasted years. Anyways, that is all for this video. A little bit of a shorter one for today, but I hope that if you have ever had any fears about taking a gap year, that this helped a little bit. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and I will try my best to answer them. If you liked this video or found any part of this to be helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more content like this. I'm trying to reach 200 subscribers by the end of this month, which may or may not be too ambitious, but we'll see. And yeah, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!